Is there any discussion, councillors? Councillor Mackenzie.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. I rise to speak against this proposal, and I rise to speak against it in no uncertain terms. I also rise to say that I will be putting a foreshadowed motion, or proposing a foreshadowed motion, on the likelihood, or on the condition that this proposal does not go ahead. And I beg Council's indulgence a little bit. This submission might go a little bit longer than 3 minutes. I'm going to reject this proposal on 3 grounds. The first is the consultation process. The second is the lack of certainty around the public good aspects of the proposal. And the third is the significant lack of an evidence base to support the argument that the transport corridor is not needed for public, active or automated transport services for Newcastle going forward. Maybe slightly premature, we'll see. I want to talk about the consultation process, and I want to talk about the fact that the report that we received clearly miscategorised 137 submissions as form submissions. They were in actual fact handwritten submissions, individual submissions, made by users of public transport travelling from Maitland to Newcastle, miscategorised in a way that gives the impression to a person reading this report on its face that those submissions were not considered. This is a serious error. Councillors, we are making a legally enforceable decision here, a legally challengeable decision here. And part of the consideration as to how we arrive at the conclusion is that we must take into consideration the community submissions. If there are 137 handwritten submissions that have not been taken into consideration, then we cannot say with certainty that we have taken those into consideration. And that becomes a grounds on which our decision is less than sufficient. I've had conversations with the Director of Planning and Regulation since, who assures me that they have, but I'm talking about the specific detail which is provided in this report. The second aspect of this report, which I find completely problematic, and I refer to page 169, the summary of submissions in support, includes the phrase, submissions expressed excitement about the development of the university precinct and so forth. It is entirely inappropriate for a document of this nature to speculate on the emotional status or the emotional state of the people making submissions one way or the other. Entirely inappropriate. This is a document where we require from council staff objective, formal information, not speculation on how people were feeling when they made their submissions. Again, I want to make the point that we have to observe the highest levels of due diligence and probity, particularly on an issue like this, particularly an issue that has so divided our community for the last decade. There is no corresponding emotional speculation on the objections, and that gives rise to the perception of bias. Thank you. The third point that I'd like to say is in relation to the ReachTel phone poll. I reject the findings of the ReachTel phone poll fundamentally and absolutely. This is a push poll. This is a push poll. Let me read the question. The New South Wales Government has advised that this corridor is not required for transport services. Do you support this or not? That is a style of essay, that is a style of survey which is designed to elicit a response. It is unacceptable for us to be presented with this kind of survey material, and I know council officers understand the difference between a survey and a push poll. It is unacceptable for this to be put across our desks as the evidence base for supporting community support or community opposition for anything. I absolutely reject the use of this push poll as the basis for determining the support or otherwise of this proposal. Council staff are welcome to their opinions, absolutely, but they must present them through the same channels that are provided for everybody else in the community. And the information presented to us, I reiterate, as councillors, on an issue of this significance, must be objective, it must be formal, it must be evidence-based, it must be free from bias. And a push poll is none of those things. The second point that I want to raise in relation to this proposal is the security of the public good outcomes, in particular the two, the university outcome and the social housing outcome. We wouldn't need this alternative motion, we wouldn't need Part B of this motion if we had secured those public good outcomes. At this point, they are still quote unquote, under negotiation. We do not have a guarantee that that land will be used for university purposes. We do not have a guarantee that the small pocket of affordable housing will be provided. That is another reason not to push ahead with so much urgency on this proposal until such time as we have those agreements in place. But I move to the most substantive part of my criticism and the reason why I'm opposing this recommendation. And that is, there is not sufficient evidence for us to say that this transport corridor will not be needed for public or active or automated transport for the City of Newcastle going forward. And that is the critical point. How would we get such information? Well, in its wisdom, on the 13th of October 2016, Council outlined a series of documents that we would require to be able to determine whether or not that transport need was required. They included a regional transport plan, they included a revised traffic report based on the current and projected land use changes in the CBD, and they included an integrated public transport plan, which outlined how public transport was going to, the operational plan about how public transport was going to meet the needs of the city going forward. To some extent, and I'm willing to acknowledge, we do have something that looks like a regional transport plan in the form of the Greater Newcastle Future Transport Plan. But I note that 2 of the policy recommendations contained in that document say preserved corridors. And there's a line on page 46, the urban renewal of Newcastle City Centre, including the University of Newcastle new space and campus, and other corridors will generate additional demand that needs to be catered for. Even that document talks about the necessity of preserving transport corridors. The revised traffic report, based on the proposal, never received. Nothing approaching it. Nothing has been placed towards councillors to demonstrate that there won't be adverse traffic impacts as a result of cutting this transport corridor. And this is a critical point because there are only 3 east-west linkages going forward. Wharf Street, in terms of getting to the East End and to the CBD. There's Wharf Street, there's Hunter Street, which is the transport possibilities of Hunter Street going forward are anyone's guess, and King Street. If you believe, and I refer to the draft Metropolitan Plan, which talks about a projected additional 4,000 dwellings in that part of town, do you honestly believe, and do we have the evidence to say, that that entire transport load can be taken by King Street? There are significant limitations on the ability for us to use King Street in this way. But we never received a transport study that would be able to determine for us how that transport would be needed. We asked for an integrated transport operational plan for the public transport going forward, never received. And this is a critical point as well, because when I talk about the lack of options for public transport or the lack of availability of public transport, I'm told, don't worry, Councillor Mackenzie, calm down. We're going to see that in the form of the light rail. The light rail will take on all of that transport. But the fact is, we don't know what the carrying capacity of that light rail is going to be. We don't have a timetable of how often it's going to run in peak periods. We don't know if it has disability access or if you can take a bike on it. We are projecting, basically on blind faith, that tram, that novelty train, is going to take on all of the public transport needs of that part of town with absolutely zero evidence. No one in this entire chamber knows whether that's possible. We don't even know how many seats there are on the light rail. So what we're being asked to do...
Sorry, can I do additional time for Councillor Mackenzie?
Certainly. Certainly. An extra minute moved and seconded. All those in favour, please raise your hand. All those against, I declare the motion carried.
Thank you, councillors. I appreciate that. So there's 2 problems here that I see. One is that there was a motion of council that was to provide us with definite information for us to make this decision, and it has not been provided. That means that we had a motion that council agreed to that was not actioned by council staff. That's problematic in a range of reasons, But what it also means is that we do not have an evidence base for us to be able to say with any kind of confidence that if we close off this transport corridor, we will not create congestion, we will not create issues, we will not need that transport corridor going forward. Because as we know, councillors, one building on that corridor renders it useless for that purpose in perpetuity, permanently. And we are being asked to make this decision. Here's the sum total of our evidence base. We have the Greater Newcastle Future Transport Plan, which is little more than a brochure. We have the blind faith of the success of this light rail proposal that we know very little about, and many transport experts have suggested will not serve the purpose that it is intended for. And we have a letter from Andrew Constance saying that we don't need the transport corridor. That is an enormous leap of faith, given that body of evidence, for us to make the decision to permanently remove the transport spine of the CBD. That is an enormous leap of faith. That is an insufficient evidence base for us to make that decision on, fundamentally. Councillors, I ask you to look at the evidence base that is before you and make the best possible decision based on that. If you are absolutely convinced, based on that evidence, that we do not need an east-west transport corridor for either public, active or automated transport going forward, then you can support this proposal. But I ask you to consider the gravity of this decision, the strength of the evidence upon which we're being asked to make it on, and make a decision in the best interests of the city going forward. Lord Mayor, I'd like to move a foreshadowed motion as well as part of this submission. And again, I appreciate the indulgence of councillors in allowing me the opportunity to speak. This has been something which has been on my mind for a number of months. My foreshadowed motion says, Council rejects the recommendations as printed on page 165 of the business paper, moves not to proceed with the amendment to the Newcastle Local Environment Plan, requests council officers be requested to draft a new proposal for the zoning of irrelevant land in a way that provision is made for land to be allocated within the rail corridor from Worth Place to Watt Street to allow for a separated cycleway to be included immediately, or for some other equivalent public transport to be reinstated at some time in the future, and that Council will confer with the State Government, Hunter Development Corporation and the Department of Planning and Environment, where relevant, to ensure that the community's expressed wishes for urban revitalisation in Newcastle, including open space, university expansion and affordable housing, be implemented in the vicinity of the corridor lands while ensuring a permanent protection of our essential transport corridors. I move that and I commend this foreshadowed motion to the Chamber. Thank you, Lord Mayor.